The first sound I remember is not the crack of the cane. It was the silence that swallowed the hall, an absolute waiting hush that made every footstep and breath feel like trespassing. That silence, more than anything, told me I had crossed a line. I had crossed it for reasons that felt stupid and enormous at once. We were seniors at Marion Hall, a school that wore its traditions like armor. We had a code: neat ties, punctuality, respect for elders, immaculate dorm rooms, and a long list of behaviors framed as character building. To me, those rules were less about morality than about belonging. Perform them, and you were included in the ritual. Break them, and you became a cautionary tale. It started with a stupid wager. We were 5 friends nursing the kind of boredom that tastes like stale popcorn. Late-night study sessions turned to dares, turned into plans. Someone joked that the headmaster's mahogany crest was a little too precious for its own good. Somebody else suggested we better understand our school by crossing into its secret places. I laughed at the idea because I had done enough minor rebellions to feel like I knew the scale of risk. That night the risk looked small. Sneak into the library after lights out, leave a note in the reading room that said, in big theatrical letters, "Tradition needs questions," and retreat before anyone noticed. Performance art, we told ourselves. A harmless provocation. A story to own. We made a plan on a Tuesday. That Thursday, under a sliver of moon, we slipped through the side gate and moved like conspirators in a play where we had rehearsed the gestures. The library smelled of dust and lemon polish, and the stacks were tall and soft with the hush of books. It felt more sacred than we'd expected, as if our prank would be a sacrilege in a temple. That thrill of being what you shouldn't be was addictive. We found the reading room table, scrawled the message on a large sheet of paper, taped it flat, and left. We took a selfie like children in a movie, triumphant and ridiculous. We were careful, laughing too loud for the space. We left with the taste of risk still fizzing. Next morning at breakfast, the atmosphere in the dining hall was one of fever. The note had been found. It was photographed and posted on the student feed the way small scandals used to spread. Faculty inboxes filled. The headmaster's voice over the intercom sounded lower than usual. We could have pretended ignorance. We could have waited to be called in for a soft reprimand and then said, "It wasn't us." But someone with a conscience, or a hero complex, sent the photo to the headmaster with our names tagged. We were identified before we had time to decide. You learn things about institutions when you get called in. The first is that they run on procedure. The second is that some procedures exist because no one in power likes ambiguity. Marion Hall's handbook had a page that read like a historical artifact. Offenses involving vandalism or public disruption may be met with formal disciplinary measures. Buried in the appendices was a clause that made students exchange color for consequence. The cane could be invoked for severe breaches of order. It was framed like a legacy clause, something to be used rarely, if at all. When the headmaster told us about the options, a board review, which would drag on and might lead to suspension, or immediate on-campus discipline carried out under supervision, the choice felt less like a choice and more like a narrowing tunnel. I was not brave. I chose the immediate path because the alternative felt like a slow rot. I thought I could take a few beats of pain and it would be over. That decision, made in an auditorium with a smell of disinfectant and old wood, was the hinge of the evening. The prep was clinical. I was led to a side hall with the others. Someone had draped a sheet over a bench to protect the upholstery. The cane sat on a small table, ordinary enough, a varnished length of rattan, smooth, unadorned, its wood catching the strip lights like a polished spine. Seeing it there made it real in a way the handbook hadn't. You can't intellectualize the feel of a thing that might touch you. You can only meet it with the muscles of your body and the calculation of your mind. They gave a brief explanation about corrective intent and protocol. phrases that sound calm until they involve your skin. I placed my palms on the bench, lifted my shirt to my waist, and bent over. The deputy's hand rested on my shoulder in a motion that was more ritual than comfort. There was no shouting. There was no dramatized display. The cane arced and landed, with a dry accuracy. The first strike was a shock that arrived in a pulse. It was clean, sharp, sound and sensation aligned. It wasn't the music of melodrama, no cinematic wail, no villain's laugh, just a keen household truth. Pain mapped itself across me like territory. My body remembered it as a geography, the warm dome of impact, the way breath was stolen, the way everything else momentarily dissolved. The second strike landed with an almost bureaucratic follow-through. The third finished the set, leaving a heat that radiated beneath the skin. Physical pain has a brutal honesty. It wakes you from excuses and narratives and places you in your body, where consequences are counted in sensations rather than in rhetoric. I learned something there about the multiplication of small choices, a daub of spray paint, a taped note, a selfie, and this. I left the hall with a pocket of silence inside me, like something hollowed out. Afterward, people treated the incident like a fact to be cataloged. Teachers marked it down in their mental registers. Some were sympathetic, some approving. A few. Students applauded in their own way, the kind of whispering praise that comes when someone has paid the price for prestidigitation. It was uncanny how quickly an event can lock someone into a role. I became, for a while, the boy who was caned. That simplification burned through me. It made me small in ways the cane hadn't. At first, I was angry at the headmaster for invoking an arcane practice that felt medieval, at myself for making the choice that put me in that place, at the whole school that could still muster such a tool of correction. Anger has a practical use. It keeps your head above the current, long enough to breathe. For a few days, I wrapped myself in complaint, surfed the waves of righteous rhetoric among friends who felt wronged, and let indignation become my armor. But indignation couldn't hold for long. The thing about being checked by physical consequence is that it invites not just a moral evaluation of procedure, but a deeper personal evaluation. In the quiet hours, when my thighs tingled and I sat across from my reflection with a bag of frozen peas to soothe the bruise, a new, colder thought arrived. I had underestimated the cost of the story I wanted. I had thought the stunt would be a line in a set of jokes. It was a sediment that settled into the bedrock of my life. What broke inside me wasn't only the tenderness of skin. It was my assumption that I could be both rebel and consequence-free. For years, a private part of my identity had been shaped by experiments against authority. I had a mental portfolio of small rebellions and the stories attached to them, some funny, some cautionary, none catastrophic. This one felt, in a practical way, like a break in an otherwise modestly safe trajectory. It was the first time the world told me in no ambiguous terms that choices could change how people saw you, and that reversal could be slow. There were other consequences. The school filed notes in my record, infraction corrected via disciplinary measure. There were the whispered looks in corridors. Some of the teachers were cold, perhaps siding with an institutional logic that believes order protects children. There was also, unexpectedly, a current of support. A few older alumni wrote to the headmaster questioning the policy and demanding a review. That tide surprised me. It made me think about how more than one narrative can coexist. There's the old one that supports discipline as a shape of order, and the new one that insists on different notions of pedagogy. The aftermath became, oddly, an education in humility. I had to show up and do the rest of the work. I wrote an apology to the school. Not a performative piece, but a careful attempt to explain motive without excuse. I volunteered hours reorganizing the archives, leading bookbinding workdays with younger students, and helping the librarians catalog donations. I had to listen to conversations I would have once cut in half with a joke. I learned instead to ask questions and to sit with answers that made me uncomfortable. At the same time, that punishment opened up an institutional conversation. Some students formed a group to argue against corporal measures and propose restorative approaches, circles, mediated apologies, educational projects that handled conflict. They published a pamphlet arguing that discipline must teach, not only hurt. Faculty committees met, alumni wrote, parents emailed. The school board, which had never had to consider such a review in my memory, convened a special session. The cane, once a relic, had become a lightning rod. This is the irony. The thing that was meant to discipline me became the lever that changed the institution. People who'd accepted the school's customs when they were students began to question them as adults. The board had to reconcile the language of tradition with the evidence of harm. That process was slow and messy and unsatisfying at times, but it was real. The school's ultimate decision to place corporal punishment under formal review and adopt a pilot program emphasizing restorative protocols felt like a small triumph. It didn't erase what happened to me. It just meant that someone else might be spared the particular path I walked. For me, the work continued in a quieter register. There were nights when I still flinched at the memory of the cane's clear strike. Pain stores itself in cognition as well as tissue. It learns to nudge your patterns. I found myself less eager to be the comic iconoclast. Rebellion didn't disappear, but I sought subtler ways to push, through work that built rather than broke, through art that asked questions. Without vandalism. I found a voice in the student council to propose changes in how the school handled student expression, and in doing so, I turned a prank into a kind of apprenticeship in civic repair. Time does the softening people promise. The bruise faded. Then the mark, then the story settled into a line in my resume for my years at Marion Hall. People forgot the gendered and sharp details, and the narrative became mine to retell with nuance. An example that included embarrassment, pain, and, eventually, a responsibility to be better. I stopped wearing the caned label like a scarlet letter. It was a paragraph in the year's history, a piece of context, not an identity. I sometimes think about what would have happened if we had chosen differently that day in the auditorium. If we had appealed and gone through a slow process, would the outcome have been more just? Would the debate I later participated in have been delayed, or would no debate have happened at all? The moral of these counterfactuals feels thin because life rarely offers redos that are as clean as we imagine. The school needed a push to change, and painfully, our action and its correction supplied it. There are critiques that are entirely fair. Corporal punishment teaches that force can be an answer, and that bodies can be sites of institutional teaching. Those critiques are not wrong. I carry them myself. Even if my own experience produced a certain humility and growth, none of that justifies normalizing physical correction as a tool. Hitting a person in the name of discipline is an ethical edge that institutions must examine, not defend. The residual lesson I hold is not one of endorsement, but of complexity. Sometimes the wrong thing leads to a right conversation, and you get to decide whether you sit in the warmth of that conversation or stoke its embers. Years later, I returned to Marion Hall for a reunion and walked past the hall where the cane had been used. The room smelled of lemon polish and the same careful maintenance that keeps old institutions looking new. I saw, in the trophy cases, a small plaque announcing the revised disciplinary approach towards restoration. It was not a victory speech. It was a note that things had shifted. I ran a hand along the rail, felt the sheen of decades of hands like fingerprints pressed into varnish, and thought about the small inventory of choices that had led me here. Told the story then in a different language. At a small alumni panel, I said plainly that what had happened to me had been a wake-up call, not just because I felt the sting and learned where my edges were, but because the aftermath demanded labor. The cane had not only struck me, it activated a community, It forced adults to see us as people who could both err and correct ourselves. It opened a door for policies to change. That felt hollowly fortunate at first, and then, over time, simply true. If there is a single line I would give to any kid thinking a prank will be harmless, imagine the ledger. Small acts accrue into reputations. They slot people into boxes that can be hard to step out of. The cane broke a part of me. The part that believed unstoppable invulnerability was mine. But it did not finish me. What fixed me, slowly, was not the pain, but the work I chose afterward. The apologies done without theatrics. The hours spent repairing what we'd damaged. The public conversations I joined to make sure fewer kids would face the same thing. There is a strange grace in realizing that repair is possible. Institutions, like people, are capable of change if enough of us have the courage to sit in the messy conversations that follow mistakes. Marion Hall changed its policy because a small scandal made it stop and ask hard questions. I changed because the sting asked me to sit with consequences long enough to learn a new vocabulary: responsibility, restitution, and restraint. I do not romanticize the cane. I do not pretend it was anything but a sharp instrument used in a moment of institutional certainty. But I also see the story in full: a prank, a punishment, pain, remorse, and then a labor toward repair that mattered. The thing that broke me was not the end of me. It was, oddly, the start of a longer chapter. One where I had to choose what kind of person I wanted to be after being broken, and where the only real redemption came from doing the small, hard tasks that stitch people back together.